Good morning to all those in America. Good afternoon to all those in Europe that are joining us today for this webinar. I would like, of course, to start by conveying a warm welcome to the outstanding group of guest speakers in this webinar. David Bjorn Berlin, Rebecca Schiff, Thomas Bruno, and Octavio Amorim Neto, some of who woke up really early to join us today. And of course, also thank Vasco Rato, the organizer of this webinar, and also Patricia Deinhardt with Vasco. They will be moderating the two panels. Thank you so much. Thank you and welcome all the participants in this meeting. I apologize on behalf of the National Defense Institute for a late start. We had a small problem with the email, with the access link, but I think it's being solved and we are starting. So why did we decide to hold this webinar? Just a few words to explain and give you our perspective. Civil-military relations have come a long way since Samuel Huntington, Maurice Janowitz, and other pioneers in the field began to consider the relationship between the state and its armed forces. With the transitions to democracy of the 70s and 80s, the problem of establishing the correct balance between the specificity of military institutions and democratic societies during periods of regime change became a central focus. Why militaries intervene and withdraw from the political realm were the prime concern. As nascent democracies consolidated, the military's role and institutional reach under civilian supremacy and the so-called democratic control of the armed forces dominated the research agenda. Today, new issues draw our attention to civil-military relations. Alternative perspectives have underlined the need for broadening the scope of traditional understandings of civil-military relations to encompass new analytical dimensions. Armed forces are tasked with defending the state from external challenges. That remains their primary mission. Yet, as the nature of these challenges changes and risks to state security mutate, it is useful to discuss how the military may play a role in addressing and resolving changes stemming from globalization, new great power relations, social networks, the impact of technology on military organization and preparedness, climate change, international migrations, among other phenomena. Are military institutions of democratic societies adequate to address these challenges? At the same time, democratic societies are changing under the stresses of income gaps, gender inequality, populist politics, and the perception of a democratic crisis. How should the armed forces adapt to these challenges? How can they be assured of adequate resources without becoming directly involved in political partisan debate? Other questions revolve around the relationship between the military and society. How may militaries establish bonds with the broader society so as to deepen mutual understandings? How can civilian oversight institutions be strengthened without generating encroachments into the military's specificity and functions? These are some of the questions that our guest speakers might address during their presentations, and that I invite all participants to explore in the debates following each panel. And so, without further ado, and wishing you all a very good debate, I give the floor to Vasco, who is the moderator of the first panel. Vasco, the floor is yours.
First of all, thank you for your participation, and especially our guests. We'll be having the first panel is a theoretical insights, and each speaker will have roughly 15 to 20 minutes to present their talk. This will be followed by a discussion. Throughout, I'll be monitoring the chat, so if you have any questions, that you want me to refer in the discussion period, or if you want to participate in the discussion period, time permitting, please let me know. The two speakers we have with us today, we're very fortunate to have these two speakers. The first is Rebecca Schiff. Rebecca received her PhD from the University of Chicago, and her research interests cover such themes as civil-military relations, NATO and American foreign policy, and ethics in military organizations. Her publications include the widely influential The Military and Domestic Politics, a Concordance Theory of Civil-Military Relations. She has taught at the U.S. Naval College at Newport and lectured at the Swedish National Defense College. She has also served as a council member for the Inter-University Seminar on Armed Forces and Society. And from California, where it is now 7 o'clock in the morning, David Pion Berlin received his PhD from the University of Denver. He is a professor of political science at the University of California at Riverside. He has written widely on civil-military relations, human rights, and defense-related issues, focusing on Latin America. His books include Soldiers, Politicians, and Civilians, Reforming Civil-Military Relations in Latin America, Military Missions in Democratic Latin America, and the tremendous book, Through Corridors of Power, Institutions, and Civil-Military Relations in Argentina. Before moving to Riverside, he taught at Ohio State, and he is an associate editor of Armed Forces and Society. Without any further ado, Rebecca, please.
All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this webinar. And once again, we are dealing with some very, very meaningful questions that have been dealt with now for decades in the field of civil-military relations. And when I saw the questions, the first one dealing with adequate resources, how to be assured that the military has adequate resources without becoming directly involved in the partisan debate, which is one of the main reasons why I entered into the field of civil-military relations, to deal with the issue of domestic military intervention. But that's the first question. The second one, dealing with bonds with the broader society. The third one is civilian oversight, and how to strengthen that without generating encroachments into the military's functionality. And the fourth, how can military education be brought into conformity with broader values? My belief is that the first and the third, dealing with civilian control of the military, can only be answered by first answering questions 2, or at least dealing with questions 2 and questions 4, because question 2 deals with the established bonds of the broader society, and 4, of course, the broader values. And that to the citizenry, which is a component of civil-military relations, which often gets, still to this day, often gets neglected in favor of institutional analysis. But if we go back to the origins of civil-military relations, first, most recently, civil-military relations started in the post-World War II era. After World War II, the U.S., assumed a preeminent role in world politics, and also was the beginning of a bipolar world with then the USSR. Civil-military relations was really dealing with the domestic relations of militaries at the time. We had gone from, a big world war dealing with totalitarian states and international militaries, and now during peacetime, we were dealing more with developing nations that were having issues, developing nations like Pakistan, nations in Latin America, which David can speak obviously more thoughtfully about, developing nations in Africa. And these nations were being threatened internally by their own militaries as we're trying to evolve into, and I hesitate to use the word modern, but into more developed states, more developed nations, because modern in one nation can mean modern in another nation, which really goes to the heart of the argument that I'm going to make in a moment. So civil military relations was about assisting these nations, these developing nations, with their militaries and how to get the militaries to synchronize with the political life of their societies. In some ways, it was successful. India's once great success story. In some ways, it wasn't. Pakistan suffered multiple coups or domestic interventions. But that's really where civil military relations, or our field, began. But I feel that civil military relations really begins much earlier. And, you know, I've talked about this philosopher many times in my courses at the Naval War College, and that's John Locke. John Locke, who most of you know, is a social contract theorist. And civil military relations is really about a social contract. John Locke was very influential on the American Constitution and Declaration of Independence. He was an Enlightenment philosopher, along with Jeremy Bentham and Rousseau and Hobbes. And they, for the most part, argued similarly, not entirely, but you know, they had similar strands of thought. And that was that, you know, people were born in a state of nature and needed to defend themselves. They needed to defend themselves individually, personally, based on their own individual actions, based on personal power and conscience, until they entered into a social contract with the state. And the social contract was really about individuals giving up certain rights, certain actions or liberties in favor of acquiring new liberties. So, you know, just very, and some of those new liberties were the all-important protection, national security protection, having a military protect you rather than having to fend for yourself. So entering into a social contract with the state really gets to the heart of what it means to have a relationship, the state and the military ultimately, because that was part of the contract. We want to be able not to have to defend ourselves, but have an institution defend our nation. And so the state, or the political entity, the political elites, the military, and the society entered into this social contract in multiple democratic nations, you know, throughout the world. And most of us live in democratic nations who are participating in this conference. And I think it's so important to understand that while democracy in America looks like American democracy, democracy in Portugal, democracy in Spain, democracy in Italy, democracy throughout Europe is very different, not just from the United States, but among different democracies. So the social contract, while on some level very similar, because it's a broad agreement between civilian and society, or between society and the government to protect the nation's borders, still is very different in terms of culture and how we approach what the military looks like. So after World War II, I fast forward again to the post-World War II era, because that's when, as Helena mentioned, some of these great theorists talked about civil military relations and what it meant. And I have argued many times before that these are all very American-bound theories. Huntington, when he talks about separation theory, he talks about the professionalization and institutionalization of American civilian and military institutions after a world after a world war that actually involved the great overlap of society and the military and politics. So Huntington's separation theory, again, is very institutional. It's very American-centric, and it's about separating institutions. What it neglects is the key element of that original social, Lockean social contract, which is society, at large that needs to be in agreement with the political elites and the military in order to have healthy civil military relations. Now, the other, pillar of thought during this time was, of course, not a political scientist. I was trained as a political scientist. But I remember when I was a graduate student seeing it in his very late years, his final days, really, Morris Janowitz walking around the University of Chicago. And he was the other great pillar of civil military relations as a sociologist. And what he said, I agree with Huntington's separation. There needs to be separate civil and military institutions. But we also need to go into the institution, the military institution itself, and look at some of the cultural aspects of it. What makes a professional? What are the customs and features of one military that makes it unique from others? What are the uniforms and social codes of the military, the etiquette, the ceremony? He opened the door to the cultural importance of civil military relations by not simply relying on that original institutional framework that Huntington set out, and sort of and exported, not, I mean, he personally didn't, but certainly policymakers did in the US to other nations. And we all know that, and I get so many correspondences from students who say, I understand Huntington's theory, but somehow it just doesn't apply to my country completely. Civil looks very different here than it does in the US. How do I make that transition to not going against civilian institutions separate from the military, but how do we regard the relationship between military and society by looking at sort of the more indigenous and broader aspects of these nations? And that's what really gets to the other two aspects, because if you want to look at issues of adequate resources and encroachments by the military or by society, you really have to go back to the society and see what that relationship is. And I think I've spent pretty much most of my academic life looking at those precise questions. And so, concordance theory is not going to be unfamiliar to most of you. But what it does is it doesn't disagree, like Janowitz, it doesn't disagree with the precepts of Huntington. But what it does do is it takes into important consideration the value of the citizenry, which again goes back to that original social contract, which makes up most democratic nations. And again, with the caveat that all democracies are different, which means that cultures are different, which means the way Portugal interacts with its military is going to be very different from the way, say, Israel interacts with its military. And, I've written quite a bit about that civil military relationship. So anyhow, so we have these three partners again, the society at large, the citizens at large, who are part of the original social contract. We have the military and we have the political elites. Well, if you want to examine about issues of encroachment and how to approach, how to make sure that your military is well equipped at the same time, what I have laid out again on those 4 indicators of concordance or agreement is that those three partners, like the original contract, must be in agreement with regard to domestic military relations on the social composition of the officer corps, political decision-making, recruitment method, and military style. So with the social composition of the officer corps, what you're doing is essentially helping to level the field. If you look at a nation like India, for example, you'll see a country that is historically based in the caste system, but the military itself has offered an avenue for all areas, all levels of society, all backgrounds of society to enter into the very important military institution. And India happens to be a great success story. Its ability to partner, to have those three partners agree on the social composition of the officer corps and the recruitment method, which generally should be a voluntary recruitment method, makes India a country not without issues and not without tensions, both internally and externally, but not a nation that has ever suffered from coup, unlike its neighbor Pakistan. So the first is the social composition of the officer corps. The second is the political decision-making process. Helena talked about, how to best equip the military. We know that we can do that most effectively. Again, we have to go back to the contract. We have to engage all three partners to make sure that the political system is something we all agree on. And if it's not, if it's something that the military and the civilian or the political elites only agree on, then you're leaving out an important partner in this equation. So if, and again, going back to Huntington, here in the US, we have separate civil military institutions. We agree on an American specified democracy, which again is very different from European democracies, from other democracies around the world. But somehow it works so that we are able to best equip our military and have agreement on that broadly in society, so that we can, move forward with our, for the most part, very healthy civil-military relations. Recruitment method, again, should be broad. And then military style, again, it's a very Janowitzian notion, but it goes back to this notion of, what do militaries look like? And it goes back to the education of the military and how it reflects the broad aspects of society. Looking at uniforms is important, because the American uniform and the British uniform are very different, for example, than the Israeli uniform. And it doesn't reflect necessarily how the militaries themselves are equipped and sophisticated and able to fight wars, but it does reflect the broad integration of societal values. The fact that Indian Sikh officers in India wear turbans, again, reflects back on those cultural integrations that successful nations with successful civil military relations understand and want to incorporate. So the four questions are very interrelated, and the issue, obviously, of intervention into the military or the military intervening into society is crucial. How to best equip our military is so critical, but it cannot be really successfully understood and certainly successfully created without that all-important component that Janowitz added to or augmented to Huntington's original theory, and that is the citizens or the society at large. So if we go back to the Lockean social contract and understand how people, the broad sectors of society, entered into this contract in order for self-protection, for national protection, we then get a glimpse at how important cultural issues matter, how different cultures are across society, and how answering some of these questions don't just involve grasping at one theory or another, but really understanding the indigenous composition of each nation that we are trying to understand. So those are my thoughts for today. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Rebecca. David, I'll pass the floor on to you.
So I'm going to talk today about a topic that's on everybody's mind, COVID, and specifically the role that militaries have played or in trying to address the crisis. The COVID presents challenges for all the nations, and very few are handling the problem well. Certainly my nation isn't. In Latin America, some of the highest infection rates exist in the world. Brazil, I think, leading at the top. And every single nation in that region has called upon the military to help out. And this is really out of necessity, not preference. I think nations are finding they cannot do without military assistance. And in fact, my country cannot do without it. The U.S. military is preparing to play a major role in storing and distributing vaccines. Military roles in this pandemic can be divided into three: medical production and supply, logistics, and public security. And militaries throughout the region are involved in one or more of these. The military involvement raises certain issues. One is whether they should be participating in pandemic relief. The other is, must they? Is this, in fact, something that countries cannot do without? What are the risks of them participating? And what are the risks of them not participating? This role in a larger context of the military intervening in domestic affairs, internal affairs, whether security or non-security related. Scholars in Latin America, have been very skeptical that military should intervene domestically, and there's some good reasons to be concerned about the military intervening, whether it be for a humanitarian project like pandemic relief or a security project like crime control. And so I'm going to go through a few of the factors that the scholars are concerned about, and then make an argument that actually the military should be involved, but has to be involved within certain parameters. I think there are basically five major concerns scholars have with militaries intervening to deal with security and non-security issues. The first is mission creep. Would the military go beyond assigned missions and expand its jurisdiction? And if they decided to do so, would civilians have the power to push them back? The second is coercion. Would the military abuse their power by, for example, to excessive repression when they are trying to enforce public curfews or stay-at-home orders, or dealing with issues at the border? State of emergency decrees, which are often issued by countries in order to trigger a military response, often accompanied with suspension of, for example, rights of habeas corpus, prohibitions on gatherings, and other limitations on citizen rights. Would the military abuse or take advantage of those emergency decrees and go further than civilians wish? Third is governance. This is the drastic scenario, which fortunately hasn't occurred yet, but nonetheless, it's on scholars' minds. Would the military perhaps go beyond mission creep and decide that they need to take over the reins of government? The fourth is leverage. If they don't do that, could they at least use this occasion to demand benefits for themselves, maybe benefits they're not entitled to, but in other words, use the counter-pandemic mission as a means to demand other things, higher budgets, perks, a seat at the decision-making table, and finally, dependence. Would reliance on the military create a longer-term dependence on the military to do things of this sort, and for governments to create and finance civilian relief agencies that perhaps could do the job as well? These are all legitimate concerns, and they've been raised in the context of other kinds of military interventions. So the interesting observation I've had when it comes to natural disaster relief, and I put the pandemic within that larger category, is that it attracted no attention at all, certainly not among political scientists and few social scientists. I think one of the reasons is the presumption that if the military is intervening for purely humanitarian reasons, everything is okay. We don't need to study that because there's no political agenda. There really isn't an issue of political opposition or ideology or anything of this sort. So was very curious to me. I went and was looking for studies, for example, on military responses to earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, volcanoes, epidemics, for example. And there's really very little done. There's a lot of stuff done by health experts, but very little done by social scientists and particularly political scientists. And as I said, I think the bias here is that scholars who are so concerned about the military participating, for example, in countering crime, countering terrorism, suppressing social protests, or even things like civic action and long-term development projects, presume, I think falsely, that because the missions are humanitarian in intent, that there aren't problems that should be observed. And in fact of the matter is that most of the military interventions on behalf of trying to alleviate the pain and suffering with respect to natural disasters has been unobjectionable. And that's the good news. But nonetheless, I think that, well, in any event, that led me to write a book on military missions. And one of the chapters was on response to natural disasters. I took a particular look at Chile and Argentina. I looked at the military response to earthquakes in Chile and floods in Argentina. And it led me to several observations which I think have relevance for the military response to COVID. And there are about 5 or 6 observations I'd like to present to you. The first is that no reason we should presume that a military response to a natural disaster should be problem-free, simply because it's humanitarian in nature. Even if the intention is worthy, there can be unintended negative consequences. And these, again, are things that can crop up in all sorts of kinds of military interventions, not just in response to epidemics or pandemics or even natural disasters. In Chile, for example, one of the problems that occurred at the outset was a legal one, that the Chilean state of catastrophe allows for an automatic on the part of the military that right at the beginning limits civilian oversight. There's questions of operational authority and autonomy. Who calls the shots during a relief effort? Clearly, there was civilian oversight, but there were limitations on civilian oversight. And the military quite often assumed leadership roles. Cooperation and coordination. How well is it done? Is it equitable? Are decisions reached jointly between civilian agencies and military agencies, or does the military dominate? And time limits. When is the military called off? When does the mission end? Who decides when the mission ends? So these problems occurred in Chile. I think that Chile did a really good job in recognizing the problems and alleviating most of them. But they are problems that exist there. They're problems that existed in other countries, and they can't be ignored. At the same time that I saw these problems, I actually found that the military is quite suitable for these kinds of missions in ways that perhaps no other institution is. And that perhaps more controversial observation I have. But I think that and I'd like to draw your attention to several things that I think are important to realize when it comes to the suitability or even the preference to use the military in response to natural disasters. The first one is that the deployment of the military, for me, is almost always a pragmatic one. It's not a political one. Governments may not have other options, ones that are immediately available, that can be taken off the shelf, as it were, that are options that can be used in a way that fits within a budget. The military can be used for these kinds of missions optimally because or when they are drawing on assets and skills that they already have in place. I find that, at least in Latin America, Latin American militaries tend to be conservative are resistant to change. They're resistant to innovation unless that innovation is provoked from the outside, which it usually isn't. So when militaries are used and the assets and skills that they have and the things that they do well are drawn upon, quite often they perform these missions well. On the other hand, there are skills that they don't have. For example, they don't know how to operate with police-like restraint. And when they're asked to do things that involve security and coercion, oftentimes they overreact. But on many other planes, they do the job well. And I think this has a lot to do with ontology. That is to say, the nature of organizations that allow them to perform during natural disasters in ways that other organizations perhaps cannot do as well. And so governments that play to military organizational strengths, I think, can use the military in beneficial ways. And I'd like to just mention 5 of these features. The first is command and control. Decisions are made at the top, and those decisions tend to be executed fairly well and efficiently. That's critical in a disaster response. When you don't have time to sit and deliberate, when you need men, women, arms, machines, equipment, medical supplies moved into position quickly, the military can do that kind of thing like no other institution. Logistical capabilities. Again, the ability to organize and move and distribute equipment, men, women, mobile medical facilities, you name it. It's a complex operation. In the United States, we're discovering that we actually will have to rely on the military to help out in that regard. The third dimension is size. The military have a large number of personnel available, and they are pre-assigned in the budget. You don't have to go and look for money. And the number of people that are under arms can transition into other roles that they also perform, and they're available. The fourth dimension is geographical reach, particularly in a pandemic that affects all sectors, all provinces, all areas in a country. It's really critical to be able to reach those areas at a moment's notice. And the military has a kind of territorial deployment that allows that. And finally, the issue of coercion. Yes, there is a public security component to responding to natural disasters having to do with enforcement of curfews, protection of borders, et cetera, et cetera. And there, of course, there is the potential for problems. But in general, I have found that at least so far, at least this year, there haven't been a lot of reports of military excesses when it comes to the provision of public security during the pandemics. By the way, there was a lot of justifiable fear in Chile in having the military intervene to deal with the horrible earthquake in 2010 because of the memories of Chilean military intervention in the past. But in the end, the military public approval for its role, and there really weren't anything in the way of excesses reported in that particular scenario. Civilian control, of course, a really important issue. Is civilian control maintained during these operations? And I would make a distinction between overall political control of the military, which has been maintained, and operational control, which I think has often been ceded to the military, again, because they can perhaps do the job more effectively and efficiently. But at the same time, ceding operational autonomy to the military does pose problems. And I think perhaps if there is something to fault democratic governments with, it's the fact that they are too ready to cede full operation to the military, and in a sense, abdicating their role to be engaged in careful oversight over what the military does. There's also concerns, legitimate concerns, about doctrine and training. And this has to do with the potential for problems to either go on for a long time or repeat themselves. So the COVID crisis, it has been prolonged. It's been going on for months, and it will certainly continue into next year. And if you ask the military to engage, one of the things that logically that they may want to do is to embed training and doctrinal innovations so that they can be prepared for the next time this occurs. And scholars legitimately fret about this, believing that once it becomes part of the military's permanent toolkit, that the governments will not be able to say no to the military in the future. And especially if the military sees that there are material benefits associated with engaging in a natural disaster response, they might insist on having their role become permanent. That, of course, refers to the other problem I mentioned before, which is dependence, that if you allow the military to exert too much of a tremendous and ongoing role, that it might be a disincentive for governments to activate civilian agencies, to finance civilian agencies and civilian alternatives to the military. The other thing that people are concerned about, rightfully so, is distraction. If you bring in the military for these kind of long-term interventions, is this taking away from their classic roles in preparedness? In the case of Latin America, this is less concerning for me because in Latin America, there's one of the more Pacific regions of the world where there's really no threats of interstate war anymore, and militaries are often idle and are not, while they should be training for defense, they're not actually used in that regard. And more, the military have been used with respect to non-traditional threats having to do with crime and the like. To finish up, I think that the military response to the pandemic is one that is essential. I don't think that any of the countries in Latin America would have been able to or are able to deal with the pandemic without intervention. And again, this is not a comment on lesser developed countries. This is a comment on a problem which is so serious and so widespread that civilian agencies, including those in the United States, are unable to deal with it by themselves and need the assistance of the military. So to conclude, I think that there are still some questions that scholars should keep when they analyze military responses to natural disasters, and particularly to this pandemic. The first is civilian control. Are countries that have stronger prior levels of civilian control better able to manage the military involvement? Is, for example, and this is an empirical question, I don't know the answer to this yet, but are countries with longer and more established levels of civilian control able to exert more oversight on the military as they perform these necessary missions? Secondly, democracy. Are stronger democracies better positioned to direct the military effort without suffering, shall we say, blowback, or suffering the repercussions of the military exerting leverage to achieve other goals? The third thing is, are higher income countries at an advantage because perhaps they have better healthcare systems and therefore can integrate the military more effectively and with better civilian management than countries of lower GDP? And finally, experience. Are countries that have used the military to fight epidemics in the past better to manage the military in their participation in the pandemic relief? Those are at least questions that I'm now as I analyze the military response to the pandemic in Latin America. And that's it. Thanks very much, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Okay, great. Thank you, David. Two very salient and interlocking complementary presentations. I have three people that have asked to present questions. Let me call upon Glenn. Could you please turn on your mic? And
yes, thank you very much. Very interesting presentations. Thank you. I'd just like to make a point coming from the European perspective, because we have NATO, so it's an issue of alliance civil military relations. And this is just the starting point of research, because we have a long list of things which have to be analyzed vis-a-vis NATO and ongoing. So I'm just going to identify 3 or 4 things, and obviously this will be agenda for many, many years to come. One, internal borders in the European Union closed. So once again, military were actually doing border control functions, for example, between Germany and Austria. The second point of view is we did have earthquakes in the European Union at the same time as COVID. In the first few weeks, Yugoslavia area in the Balkans. And just last week, 10 days ago, we had in Greece, in the islands. And the third point, obviously, is NATO forces are deployed around the world. So we have to look at things such as force rotation, for example, in Afghanistan, or there are 14 out of the 13 NATO member states which are deployed to United Nations force in Lebanon. So we have to look at how do we bring the forces back for rotation with their families. What is the nature of training to take them out again to that deployment area? So we have a thing which relates both to what David was talking about recently in the last lecture, but also to what Rebecca was talking about in terms of the social contract, is what is the role of the military vis-a-vis traditional border control mechanisms, in addition to everything else, in this nature of earthquakes, the rotation of forces outside of areas. And a last point, obviously, is the things such as the NATO Science and Technology Organization, STO. There's about 6,000 scientists involved in NATO. And in the first few minutes of going into lockdown, NATO STO, which is based at Nous de Chile in Paris, called upon all the scientists to be involved. And the very first project was surveillance, how to map. And very much involved in that mapping is telephone surveillance of where individuals are to identify red zone. Military was involved in the security function of mapping citizens' locations. So having identified all those points, I think there'll be many, many more points coming up in the next few years to actually look at. But if we're looking at Rebecca for a question of social contract, and if we're looking in terms of David, in terms of alliance CMR, in terms of more traditional roles of going back into a military role, but also force deployments and rotation of forces. Thank you.
would you like to go first, Rebecca?
Here we go. So I think it's a very important point to make about NATO, because not only are you involving militaries in one European nation, but you're involving multiple militaries, across many nations, which means you're also dealing, although there is an alliance and there are sort of prescribed institutions that NATO has, for a long time set out to conduct and have implemented and has done very well, especially in these kinds of although COVID obviously is very unique, but certainly when it comes to issues of other types of international emergencies, NATO has a pretty good track record, but again points to the uniqueness of each nation and how they are going to adapt their COVID situation, because every nation across Europe is adapting to COVID very differently. So NATO has to be even more nimble than perhaps even the American military. Obviously, America is part of NATO, but the U.S., for the most part, knows. We as they say here in the United States, this isn't the first rodeo for the U.S. military in dealing with national crises. Granted, COVID is very, very different in nature, very very unique in the way it has devastated so many communities and people. But I'll give you one example coming from the U.S. and then going back to this issue of NATO. Every time I go to California and come back, because I have a business in California, I come back, I take a COVID test, and I always go for the last 3 COVID tests. I always go to the site that is managed by the military. Okay, I could go to the local CVS, I could go, to the local clinic or whatever, but I always go to the military site because in my mind and efficient, it has been proven to be a much more efficient turnaround, and just the way in which they engage with the civilians seems more effective. Just my one civilian's view on interacting with the military and COVID, and I think for the most part Americans applaud the fact that the military is on alert here to deal with the vaccine that is obviously going to be prominent in the next few weeks, and the distribution of the vaccine. And there is no sort of crises as there were in, for example, David gave the Chilean example during the earthquake. The military really had to prove itself. But the military here seemed still the most, considered the most honest institution in the U.S. So, but it understands its culture. I think in Europe with NATO, there's dilemmas because you have well, in a very effective institution, you're going to have the rotation issue, which is a big part of a civil military predicament, bringing your troops home, and also dealing with multiple cultures and how to contend with the pandemic, being a sort of an outside force going into different nations. So I think Europe, and this goes back to my original point, every democracy in Europe and the United States is different, and dealing with the cultural subtleties of each nation, especially during a national and international emergency, I think is going to be even more challenging for the European continent.
Should I jump in, Bosco?
Yeah, please. But before you do, I also have a question addressed specifically to you. Let me just read it out, if I can find it. How different are military-led interventions in the past to military requested by politicians interventions? So you have actually 2 questions to deal with.
Unsolicited military interventions in the past as opposed to government requested interventions. Is that the question?
That is the question.
Well, sizably different. And so, obviously in the past, before democratic transition, and even in the early phases, militaries were operating autonomously. And they were making decisions about security and national development and everything else. That's not the case now. all military interventions in Latin America are at the behest of civilian authorities. And that's the good news. Militaries are undertaking missions because they're asked to undertake missions. The other point I would make, reference to the first issue on border control. I think here it's a case of the military maybe killing 2 or 3 birds with one stone, because the military have normal border patrol operations. In recent decades, I think a lot of that has been directed to try to identify and arrest transnational criminal organizations, human trafficking. Now they're double duty because they have to be concerned about, or let me say, that governments are concerned about their borders and the and restrictions on the free flow of people to and from because of the spread of the virus, but also people from one country perhaps wanting to take advantage of the health facilities in another country. And those are legitimate border issues that that the military has to deal with. As far as the mapping of citizen locations, well, you know, so here's the between concerns with civil liberties on the one hand and security on the other. And it's a balancing act that is that the military does not pull off well, quite often. And there are all sorts of excesses. And yes, there is the danger that that the pandemic can be used as a opening for the military to extend its powers and influence in areas that it shouldn't, having to do with issues of privacy and civil liberties and the like. And so that's something that, again, civilian governments should be engaged in oversight and watching that to see that the military stays within appropriate boundaries.
I just want to add one more thing. I mean, I think when we talk about the military, especially when we're talking about the military in Europe and specifically with NATO, we're talking about many militaries, and I think that one interesting project, future project, would be is how certain military compositions of NATO responded in different regions or countries of Europe with respect to the pandemic, and how culturally those differences made a difference with respect to helping or hurting the population. Because, you know, the long-standing issue, and I think it's part of our, you know, American sort of bias about, you know, who we are as, you know, Americans and our civil military relationship, is that we talk about the military, but when we talk about Europe, we're talking about different militaries, we're talking about different cultures, and we're talking about different challenges that NATO, despite its efforts to be streamlined and cohesive and have, you know, similar values with respect to important missions, is still dealing with distinct cultures, not just within inside its own military. I mean, the Estonian military is very different from the German military. You know, we need to really dig a little deeper in how we interpret militaries and their response to specific issues in very specific regions of the world.
Great. I actually have a comment. I addressed to Rebecca, I actually agree that obviously all democracies are different, but democracies do have common features that allow us to characterize them as democracies. Otherwise, we'd be getting into a problem of conceptual overstretching. The same as militaries. Obviously, all militaries are different, but they are still militaries. My question is this. I agree with you that military academies are an excellent instrument for social mobility because they are social equalizers. The problem is that when you have military academies and they take in people from different backgrounds, what comes out is a new identity. And that new identity often has led to a sense of separateness that politically translated into a sort of a new class that intervened sort of as the modernization vanguard. I mean, we have a lot of examples from the Egyptian officers movement to the Peruvian military, etc. So how exactly do you square all of this?
You know, bringing in diversity I think in any nation into the military and into the military institution. You know, I taught at the Naval War College for many years, and I will say that whenever I had foreign officers in my courses, the merit for the predominant were thrilled because they were thrilled at the dimension to the way they thought about military duties and culture.
David, do you want to comment on my comment, perhaps?
Yeah. Well, so what yours is about kind of institutional similarities between militaries, notwithstanding country differences.
No, mine was a little bit different. Yeah. This idea that no matter how diverse the recruitment process is, ultimately the outcome is not very different, and that raises a very dangerous problem of generating sort of a new class identity that is propitious for military intervention.
Oh, well, if you're talking about recruitment, I guess I would disagree. The recruitment processes quite different across countries and regions, and I think probably the most important studies of the last decade or so arose out of the Arab Spring. Understanding that how militaries are recruited can play a decisive role in determining the degree to which militaries stay loyal to regimes or not. So you have, for example, you have the idea of ethnic-specific recruitment, which results in militaries that perhaps are more loyal to certain regimes and more vigorously antagonistic towards the outgroups. You have militaries that are conscripted across broader sectors of society. And all of this was studied in relationship to the problem of regimes facing down large-scale protests but elsewhere. I've applied these models to Latin America. So I think recruitment patterns are different, and the composition of militaries that you end up having is different. I'm recently completed studies on the and here I have my my graduate student who I think is right there. He is, Igor. We've looked at recruitment patterns in terms of ethnic composition in certain Latin American countries and found it makes quite a difference in terms of how military leaders react to social protests and whether there is a ethnic bond between the military and the protesters or an ethnic antagonism between the military and protesters makes a huge difference. So I don't know if that gets to what you were wanting, Vasco, on that, but
I didn't get to also finish my point. If you look, and this is falls in line with David's comments. If you look at a country like Pakistan versus India, India, like I said, has been so diligent in trying to recruit broad sectors of its society and has done quite well in educating and sort of leveling the playing field in its military education while remaining a very professionalized military. If you look at Pakistan in the 60s and the evolution of Bangladesh happened because Pakistan refused to integrate a huge sector of its own country, namely the East Bengali sector, not just economically, but also into its military. They consistently discriminated against the East Bengali segments of society. And it really led to the complete disenfranchisement and an eventual succession of East Bengal into the current country of Bangladesh. So when you don't have, and this goes back to the great theorist Samuel Feiner, when you don't have recruitment that is voluntary and diverse, it tends to actually lead to the kinds of concerns that you're bringing up. Whereas diversity among, military recruits and educating and truly integrating that diversity into the armed forces, I think leads to more positive outcomes.
We're about 4 minutes away from closing this session. I have time for one more question. George, could you please the question you sent me by chat, please?
Yes. Good afternoon from Athens. I have a question. How do you comment the humanitarian catastrophe and also natural disaster for Armenian people who are obliged to quit their homes in Nagorno-Karabakh? And do you think that Russian militaries who are developing an interference force can help, or their presence there is worsening things?
Okay, the question was, how do you comment the catastrophe in Nagorno-Karabakh and the removal of Armenian citizens from their homes? I think, George, that was the question.
Yes, yes.
I'm gonna take a pass. What I will do is, if he can submit that question to me in an email, I'd like to, and this way I can give him a much more effective and elaborate answer at another time.
Okay, then I have one more, which is this. Can Donald Trump's decisions to withdraw troops from Afghanistan, is it a legitimate decision? Somebody, it's that question.
Well, I have actually I'm reluctant to give Donald Trump credit for anything, but his impulse is correct here, even though his strategies and tactics are something to be desired. But the notion that we have been in Afghanistan for 19 years now with absolutely, well, virtually nothing to show for it is a really a disgrace. But Trump thinks that being commander-in-chief means issuing a tweet and then doing no other thought besides that. And so the withdrawal, I think, is necessary, but it has to be planned strategically so that it's done in a way that's in coordination with the government of Afghanistan, in a way that doesn't put additional lives at risk, things that he never thinks about. But I think in the end, it's high time that the U.S. Either very quickly figure out how to make a deal with the Taliban, or cut and get the hell out of there.
I disagree with David that the president pretty much created the Middle East in the last several months. But I do agree with the idea of removing troops from Afghanistan, because, as David pointed out, we don't have much to show for it in Afghanistan militarily, and I think that strategically removing troops is a positive move.
Well, thank you, but I don't think either one answered, because the question was, is it legitimate for a president that has basically 2 months left to do it?
He's still the president of the United States.
Yeah, correct. I agree with Rebecca.
Okay.
He's still the president. Hopefully he won't be the president after January 20th, but with this lunatic, one never knows for sure.
Yeah, he's still the viable president of the United States.
All right. It's 4:30. We have to end here. I'd like to thank Rebecca and David. And David, thanks so much for getting up at 7 o'clock in the morning.
No, 6.
6. Well, even worse. But it was a very interesting discussion, very productive. And please stay with us for the next. We're going to take about 15 minutes, 10-15 minutes, just so everybody can get a coffee, and then we'll be right back.
Will do. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, participants. A warm welcome to on comparative military relations in Europe and South America. We are honored to have with us here today. Each speaker, similarly to the first panel, will have 15 to 20 minutes to present their talk, after which we will have a debate, for which I ask everyone who would like a question down in the chat room, and then I will put it to the speaker. You would like to pose it yourself to one or both speakers, please let me know also once you write the question down that you would like to yourself. And our first speaker is Dr. Thomas Bruno, who is a distinguished professor emeritus with the Department of National Security Affairs at the Naval at Monterey in California. Became director of the Center for Civil Military Relations in 2000, a position he held until 2004, and he served as a rapporteur of the Defense Policy Board that provides the U.S. Secretary of Defense with independent advice on questions of national security and defense policy. His areas of expertise are civil military relations, Latin American politics and security, contracting out security, intelligence, and intelligence reform in new democracies. He co-writes the annual report on Portugal for the Bertelsmann Foundation in Berlin, Foundation's Governance Indicators publication, and he has recently published several scholarly articles on issues of civil military relations, outsourcing security, and intelligence reform in democracies. He has published 7. Recent one, co-edited with Aurel Croissant, is called Civil Military Relations, Control and Effectiveness Across Regions. Was in 2000. Our second speaker, Dr. Otávio Amorim Neto, holds a PhD in politics at the San Diego campus and holds a Master in Political Science from the University Research Institute of Vienna. Professor in the School of Public and Business Administration at Fundação Getúlio Vargas. He was a research professor at the University, namely at the University of Salamanca, the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Lisbon, at the Institute of Higher Studies of Administration in Caracas, and a visiting professor at the Institute for Political Studies in Lille. His work has been published in scientific journals such as, among others, American Journal of Political Science, Latin American Politics and Society, and Armed Forces and Society, and he is a member of the editorial board of various journals. He is the author of the books entitled From Dutra to Lula, The Conduct and Deterrence of Brazilian Foreign Policy, and of the book called Prudentialism and Governance in Americas. Without further ado, I pass the floor on to Thomas Bruno. Thomas, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Let me just add one note and one plug on what was the last point on the last panel. That is, if the United States pulls its 2,500 troops out of Afghanistan, that will leave, financed by the Department of Defense, 22,562 contractors, of which 7,856 are American citizens. So this is simply a plug for the project I'm working on now, which is on the Department of Defense outsourcing of services. The services include the topic of an earlier book of mine on private security contractors, but a whole bunch of other things as well. And Department of Defense alone spends approximately $150 billion each year on service contracts. These are separate from the other contracts to buy ships and airplanes and all that. So it's a huge topic that we're working on right now. Okay, so for my presentation, I think 12 or 15 minutes will hopefully do. I was hesitant to deal with the topic as it's defined, comparisons Europe, Latin America, because a few years ago, I made a presentation in Lisbon. It wasn't at the Instituto de Defesa Nacional, for which I have the highest regards, and I've been there many, many times, but it was somewhere else. And the late General Jose Loureiro dos Santos, Jose Loureiro dos Santos, really got up, who had been Chief of Staff of the Exército, of the Army, and Minister of Defense. And he got very upset when I was making some comparisons in which I somehow used in the same sentence Portugal, Chile, and Brazil. So I'm kind of hesitant about making comparisons, especially with an expanded Europe and, of course, a very complicated Latin America. So what I thought I would do would be, in order to provide material for the interaction, for questions and observations and all that, some background, and then some of the conclusions that Oro Croissant and I came up with from the study we published that dealt with civil-military relations in 10 different countries. So I became interested in this topic of civil-military relations because I happened to be in Portugal on the 25th of April, 1974. And I saw from the beginning then, and I was able to get back many times, how the military assumed a certain role in politics. And then specifically, after many, many visits, research visits, I spent my sabbatical 1992, 1993 in Lisbon with short trips to Madrid, studying the defense policies of Spain and Portugal. This was NATO, EU, Maghreb, all that type of stuff, base rights, that kind of thing. That really turned out to be a study of civil-military relations because, you know, who's making these policies? So it turned out to be a study of how these policies were made. Then from that background, I became interested in this topic of civil-military relations. And what I'd like to do now would be to bring up 3 points about the why, how, and what, and then bring up some of the sort of conclusions that I have based upon the studies that I've made here and there over the years. The first thing is the why. Why my study of civil-military relations? It's because here at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, where we have officers from all the U.S. services, junior officers, sort of lieutenants, captains, maybe majors, lieutenants, lieutenant commanders, that sort of thing. And we have students from about 50 other countries as well. I found myself teaching courses on civil-military relations, and I didn't find the literature, the classic literature, any of the literature except maybe Samuel Feiner of much use. I didn't find it very, very relevant. So I decided then that I should learn as much as I could about this topic, and I got into it. And the how was, not only did we have students here from whom I learned, but then through the Center for Civil Military Relations, where I was director for 4 years, but I was also program manager for Latin America for 16 years. I did seminars, normally 1-week seminars, in approximately 40 different countries, everywhere in Latin America except Venezuela, but also in Armenia, Mali, Mongolia, et cetera, everywhere except the Middle East. And as Octavio went to San Diego, to La Jolla, I went to Berkeley. So me as a trained researcher from that stint in Berkeley, and as I would utilize these seminars of 1 week, more or less, as an opportunity to learn from the people, the civilians and military in these seminars about democratic civil military relations. But I would also use the opportunity to go out and interview people. And since we were holding these seminars in ministries of defense and joint staffs and all that, I had access. So I utilized those opportunities that I had to go out and to learn as much as I could. And that became, and as a trained researcher, obviously I take a lot of notes. You know, I would take notes every night, and I would save up all of these types of notes. So material that I accumulated then, and with maybe the high points in our long-term work in Colombia and also in Mongolia, I attempted to reframe these concepts of civil-military relations. And many of you, David certainly, are very familiar with this thing that I've come up with about control, but control, democratic civilian control. But, in many countries, it's simply a facade. It doesn't really work. Nicaragua, been there many times. It was kind of a joke, really. It was still the Sandinista military and a few political hacks who were supposedly in charge of them. So the point that I wanted to bring up then is that it requires certain institutions to be able to, in fact, exert this supposed democratic civilian control. And then the other thing that I brought up was the effectiveness. Now, this became very, very clear to me because and David's totally familiar with this, because of our work in Colombia, where they actually did have to fight against the FARC and other paramilitaries and other armed organizations. And then it became very stark for me in some of our work in Mongolia, when I would talk to the colonels who had all been trained in Russia, or the Soviet Union, I guess, at that time, and who considered their main mission was territorial defense. Well, if you look at a map for about 1 minute, you'll see they're located between Russia and China. So territorial defense was kind of a joke, and bad joke, in fact. But what they were really doing was peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance in support of the United States, and the United States rewarded them for that. So the point that I came up with then is that in order to study civil-military relations, and this is clearly from a political power standpoint, one has to think about the institutions involved in both exercising control and somehow achieving effectiveness. Now, the thing that we have come up with then, with regard to effectiveness, its effectiveness, and David touched upon this, its effectiveness at what roles and missions? I mean, is this territorial defense? Is it counterterrorism? Is it military support to civilian authorities? Is it dealing with COVID? What is it? Because not every country is prepared to cover the full spectrum of different roles and missions. Well, what Aurel Croissant and I came up with in this book, where we have case studies of Russia and China and the United States and Tunisia and Turkey and Chile and Indonesia and Japan, we come up with basically four different patterns in which we try to explain the nature of civil-military relations, seen in terms of, and the title of the book, Civil-Military Relations, Control and Effectiveness Across Regimes. We come up with four different sort of models, or four different explanations. And the first one is what we would call basically the maintenance of power. And this would be this would be the United States. It would be Egypt. It would be Turkey as well, to somehow maintain the power, or the particular relationship between the military and civilians that had pre-existed in these countries. The second one, because we had the case studies of Japan and Germany, and it's only when we had a workshop involving Germans and involving Japanese, it became clear that the particular arrangement was one which was imposed upon them because of their defeat in the war. That is, that a very, very limited military role and a role of sort of humanitarian assistance, peacekeeping, that sort of thing. The third one, and we looked at Chile and Indonesia and Tunisia as examples of this, is basically a relationship established through the negotiations during a political transition from some sort of authoritarian regime to a democratic regime, where things were and still are fairly tentative and in a process of evolution. And then the last one that we come up with is with China and Russia, and this is basically a maintenance of the power relationship, where the power of the supreme leader, Putin, for example, is closely related to how effective the military is at doing whatever it is that it's doing or it's preparing to do. And of course, now with us and China, this remains to be seen. And with Russia, it could be this what was worked out in Karabakh, etc. Excuse my dogs that are barking, or in Syria, for example. So in conclusion, then, the way I approach these topics, and I appreciate what Octavio is doing through developing quantitative methodology, is basically through elite interviews, trying to figure out what politicians, what military think they're about, what they're coming up with, what sort of resources they get. So this is basically the approach, and I'd be happy to talk about anything that you think I might know something about, and push the kind of approach that I've developed. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I must apologize. I've been having trouble. I hope you can see me, and I hope you can hear
now
me.
Now I can. I couldn't see you before, and I don't know if you could see.
Sorry. I'm so sorry. I could see myself, so I assumed everyone else could. So I'm glad to know that now you can see me. And without further ado, I'll give the floor to Ottavio. Ottavio, please.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this conference with three giants in the study of civil-military relations. I'm a newcomer in this research field, and today I'm going to present a paper that was just published in the Brazilian edition of the Journal of Democracy, called Journal of Democracy in Portuguese. This paper is co-authored by Cássio, who happens to be here. He is an advisee of Professor Payam Burling. And actually, what I'm going to do is to talk about the situation of my country since the election of Bolsonaro to power in 2019. So I'm not going to be discussing new challenges, but old challenges in civil-military relations. Why? Because since Bolsonaro came to power, Brazil has become a militarized democracy. Now, approximately 40% of cabinet members have a military background. They are either active duty officers, retired officers. Moreover, there are now 6,000 military officers on government posts, not necessarily on defense-related posts. Most of them, more than 3,000, are active duty officers. So what Igor Cássio and I try to do is to understand the causes and the consequences of the militarization of a consolidating democracy. This is really surprising because a few years ago, Brazil was progressing, was moving forward in terms of the military relations. Although Brazil did not reach the level of civilian control over the military as Argentina and Chile, Brazil was slowly moving forward. What is novel about the militarization of politics in Brazil nowadays is that it was a democratically elected president who brought so many military officers to power. In the past, in the relatively recent past, Brazil had the longest military regime ever in Latin American history. from 1964 to 1985. So Praetorianism has always been a problem in Republican Brazil since the late 1960s.
Maybe, as I see that we have half an hour left, maybe what we could do, Pedro, if you would agree, is that we would take some questions for Thomas, open the chats to Thomas, and then maybe from the administrator, from the part of the Institute, they could get in touch with Otavio to see what is going on. Do you think that would be? Give us a couple of minutes, and
Yes.
I think that's what we'll do. Okay. So, everyone, questions that you would like to ask to Thomas Bruno in the chat room. I see there's one from Glenn Segel. I'm not sure. Oh, there you are. Would you like to ask it, Glenn?
Yes.
Say it
We
again,
have
please.
a country who is a former colonial power deploying forces to its former colony. We have many options of deciding why. One of these could be that it is for the sake of the receiving country, which has a conflict, so it is per se conflict resolution or humanitarian deployment. On the other hand, we could say that it is once again the former colony acting for the purposes of exporting its ideology, philosophy, and political system to have a regime change in its former colony. So if we were looking at European Latin American relations, because most of what I've said is very much more France and Britain into Africa. But if we want to look into the Latin American, South American context, could we actually say that not just per se a military deployment, but maybe security, maybe drugs, maybe human trafficking, maybe United Nations, to what extent would this fall under category A? And to what extent would this fall under category B? To what extent, therefore, is the European former colony, colonial power, acting as in its own interest, or for the sake of the interest of the conflict in its former colony?
Okay, thank you very much.
What,
Glenn, I'll give the word to Thomas.
Well, first of all, what's the empirical reference? I can't think of a former colonial power from Europe doing something in Latin America. I'm familiar. I've spent a lot of time in Guinea-Bissau, so I know something about Portugal and Guinea-Bissau. But Glenn, tell me what you have in mind here. I don't get the empirical reference.
Well, we can take it all the way through from the involvement, for example, in Contra. We could take it in anti-terrorist activities, where we could even take it, for example, in United Kingdom and the Falklands. Could take it, for example, in BRICS, Brazil, the economic side of things, not just in terms of deployment, but also in terms of Brazil's defense industries. So we could go very, very broad in terms of just what is the role of the former colonial power in terms of military defense equipment, or even in control of maybe Brazil's deployment of a naval component to the United Nations force off the coast of Lebanon.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Maybe what we will do before giving the floor to Thomas is just checking with Octavio if it's fine for him to re-engage with us. So what we'll do, we resume with your presentation. I apologize for this inconvenience. And then after that, we'll resume with the debate and take a few more questions. Thank you, Octavio. The floor is yours.
Okay, well, I'm going to try again. Well, I'm not going to open my PowerPoint because it may make things even worse. So what are the causes of the militarization of the Brazilian government under Bolsonaro? Well, first of all, Bolsonaro is an army officer. And moreover, he had never had any special political party. So when he came to power, he did not have any set of people to help him govern effectively. So the military were useful in this regard. And this is the standard explanation offered in Brazil of his term. But we think, Igor and I think, that there's a more political.
Unfortunately, it seems that we've lost you once again, Ottavio. That's very, very unfortunate. I think what we'll do is that we'll take some more questions from the audience. There's one for Thomas, which is the following. What would be, in your opinion, Thomas, the position regarding the emergence of private military companies in democracies and their increased use by democracies? Does that not lead to an erosion of civil-military relations, but above all in a state's responsibility? Would you like to comment on that, Thomas?
Yeah, sure. I wrote a book about this. It's called Patriots for Profit, Contractors and the Military in U.S. National Security. It's obviously a very polemic topic. And it is not just the United States that uses private security contractors, or private security contractors such as Eric Prince use the United States government, where his sister, of course, is the Secretary of Education in the Trump administration. But it also applies to Great Britain, and increasingly now to Russia and to China, certainly in Africa. So, but they're neither, from my point of view, neither China nor Russia are democracies, whereas the United States and Great Britain are. The challenge, or the problem, as I see it, is that the private security companies are basically for-profit businesses, and they are able to lobby. They're able to do strategic communications, so that they, it's all about money. Finally, they're able to get the contracts to be able to do various things in Iraq, Afghanistan, Mali, you name it, Libya, Syria, etc. They're able to get the contracts. And it's a way for basically governments to, that's why I started at the beginning, just citing this data. So the United States military gets out of Afghanistan. Well, there are, 10 times as many private security contractors, many of which are private security contractors, still in Afghanistan. But it's a way that some governments have found to turn over an important function to some other kind of organization. And from our studies now, I'm working on this right now. In fact, in this new book, in the case of the United States, there was a commission on wartime contracting in Iraq and Afghanistan, which made a whole series of recommendations, but none of those recommendations were ever implemented by through the United States Congress or through the Department of Defense. So it's one of these areas that is very, very flaky, and the implications for democracy, I think, are fairly negative. Anyway, but again, I wrote a book about this.
Actually, if I may, I would like to ask a question regarding, since we're talking about South America and Europe, one thing that strikes me is that there's obviously an institutional difference between the two parts, which is the European Union. And the question I would have liked to pose to both of you, but which I'm posing to you now, Thomas, is to what extent do you think, or have you found in your research, that the existence of an institution such as the European Union, does that in any way enter this domain of civil military relations, or is this still a domain whereby the nation state as such is completely sovereign, and so an institutional framework, an attempt by the EU to create a common security and defense policy, a common foreign policy, does not play a role at all? And if I may add to this one other point, because you mentioned it in your presentation, you looked in your research at different countries, and including Germany and Japan, and you obviously made a sort of comparison between these two countries. I find it very interesting that, of course, you made the point there was an imposition, an external imposition, because both these countries were defeated in the Second World War. And my question would be, to what extent has this now, 70 years after the end of the Second World War, not become sort of almost a panacea or an excuse, you know, for Germany, I guess more than Japan, to resort to this situation, leaving its military to engage in peacekeeping and humanitarian missions, as you mentioned, but much less in other sort of a more assertive role, because it always takes refuge in a way, doesn't it, in this argument that it can't really and it shouldn't engage, it shouldn't be an assertive or an active military actor, but that in a way is also of a certain convenience in terms of not doing more than they should. And this also plays into NATO defense spending, but that's a totally different ballgame.
Well, those are two very different and excellent points or questions. So the first one of the things that I looked at very closely when I was studying the transition from a high military role in Portugal to a much lower military role was the role of NATO, but especially of that time, the Federal Republic of Germany. So this was the opportunity for Germany at that time to launch itself beyond an economic monster and a military weakling type of thing. And then this was before Trumpism, of course, and the United States also played a positive role at that time in the evolution. So this was, for me, and people who've written on Spain have made a big point of Aguero's book on Spain, the transition and the role of the military. NATO was very important there as well. Now, today with the European Union, the role is tremendously important. One of the things I work on as well is intelligence and oversight of intelligence. And when it comes to oversight of intelligence agencies, because of the EU and the various laws that are involved there, oversight is much more aggressive in the EU countries of Europe than it is in the United States, for example. Although here we have a very active role of Congress. But with the human rights of the EU, that's extremely important. So the EU and NATO together played a huge role in the evolution of the new members, be it Romania, Bulgaria, et cetera, in framing. Right away with NATO, you have to have a civilian minister of defense. I mean, and you also have to have a staff that goes along with it. So this was extremely important in the expansion of Europe. Poor Latin America is stuck with lousy United States and the Organization of American States and this and that, which adds up to almost nothing as far as speaking as an individual and not representing any organization. So these NATO plus EU was of fundamental importance in Europe in the evolution of the former Warsaw Pact countries. The other point that you made, for me, as we did this book, Oral Croissant and I, he had a workshop there in Heidelberg. He had a workshop, and the author of the chapter on Germany was there participating, and we did a Skype connection with the woman who did the chapter on Japan. So what I came away from, in both cases, in both Japan and Germany, they've held very close to the humanitarian assistance, maybe peacekeeping and all that kind of thing. And from my cynical view, it basically is a good way to save money. You know, that maybe Trump doesn't like this with Germany, but it's a good way to save money that they continue to refer to in Japan to the Constitution, to, well, you know, about Germany as well. They refer to that, but also, you know, defense costs a whole bunch of money. I mean, to have the level that one would expect of countries like Japan and Germany, and what they had, you know, during the Second World War. So that it fits in with the justification. This is what I gathered from the author, who's a reserve colonel in the German army. The sense of this works very, very well with society and what society is willing to put into military issues, hard power versus, you know, social welfare, good things, health, you know, sorts of things that the United States is so stingy about. Okay. So that's my reading of it. Not, you know, I don't know.
No, thank you so much, Thomas. Great answer. I've just been told that Otavi will make another attempt.
What I'm going to say is that on top of the appointment of many military people to cabinet posts, Bolsonaro has been trying to associate his government with the military in many ways, attending to many official military ceremonies more than any other president in the past 35 years. He has granted a pay raise to the military. He has increased defense budget, and he has given a lot of autonomy for the military, their own business, and to make defense policy. So this is a very coherent package to associate the military with his government and to co-opt the military. And as I was trying to explain, this has to do with some factors, the most important of which is that Bolsonaro is a very weak president in terms of, and in Brazilian history, presidents who do not command a legislative majority tend not to end their constitutional terms. So Bolsonaro anticipating an impeachment has been using the military as a deterrent against any move by Congress. And he has offended and attacked Congress and the Supreme Court from January 19, when he was sworn in president, and June 2020, when he was forced to stop. Moreover, we now have evidence that in May this year, he will strike at the Supreme Court. So this is not a new challenge. This is old Latin America. Brazil feels like Brazil in the 50s, Latin America in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s. And this is surprising because, as I was trying to say, till 2015, Brazil had made, in terms of democratizing civil-military relations, establishing civilian control over the military. Long story short, what are the consequences of Bolsonaro for civil-military relations? First, so to answer this question, we have to resort to the work by Narcís Serra, a former defense minister of Spain under Prime Minister Felipe González. Narcís Serra, in his now widely known book, shows there are three phases when countries begin to democratize. He was referring mostly to Iberian countries and Latin American countries. The first phase is to avoid military coup. The second phase is to remove the military from the political arena. The third phase is to establish supremacy. By 2015, Brazil was from the second phase to the third phase. Now Brazil is back to the first phase. The backsliding in civil-military relations in Brazil is simply amazing. And it's to scholars like Tom Bruno and Pion Berling, who have been studying Brazil, but also to Brazilians themselves. And now Bolsonaro has been weakened due to many factors. I'm not going to waste your time on that, but discussing what can be done to reverse all the backsliding observed in civilian control over the military. The first idea is to remove from the Constitution an article that says that one of the role of the armed forces is to protect the constitutional power. This is a very ambiguous article, and it has been used as the constitutional basis to justify any intervention, either in public security, law and order maintenance, so on. And since Bolsonaro came to office, to participate in politics as though were a political party. The other idea is to finally enact into law something that was official in the documents published by 12 years ago, to create a civilian career of defense within the Ministry of Defense. So this is a very old debate for all of you who have been studying the democratization of civil-military relations. This look of Latin America in the 80s, in the 90s, or Eastern Europe in the 90s. And Brazil is back to all. And to make a long story short, politics is also important in terms of removing the military from the. We need an ample coalition to approve many measures that could prevent the military from entering the political arena again, supposing that Bolsonaro is when it ends. And we have to resort to our slow and long transition to democracy from 1974 to 1985. Removing the military from the political arena was supported by parties and politicians from the center to the extreme left. And this coalition needs to be again. And the pivotal actor would be the center right. Historically, throughout the 20th century, the center right was the actor that helped always helped the military to intervene in politics along, obviously, libertarians and the extreme right. And moreover, in the next presidential election, our presidential hopefuls and have to debate something they have never debated before: defense policy, military politics, and the role of the military. Only with this issue being brought up during the presidential campaign, a civilian president have a political mandate to remove the military from the political arena? And I'm sorry for all the technological confusions that are totally out of my control. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ottavio. I'm happy that you managed to make your presentation. After all, sorry it didn't work out with the PowerPoint, but I think you gave us enough food for thought. What I would do is I would immediately read some of the comments and questions which are directed to you. So the question in the chat was actually, one is more of a comment saying that the people who go to the candidates of the Brazilian War College, more than 50% of the audience who take the courses are military, and that happened even before Bolsonaro. On the other hand, one question is directed, and you've spoken about this in your presentation, is to what extent do you think that the Brazilian militaries feel represented by Bolsonaro's trajectory during his short military career? Would you like to?
Okay, thank you. Hear the first question well, so let me try the second one. The military are in a very ambiguous position under Bolsonaro because they have received many benefits. They have received a lot of political power. And at the same time, all these appointments of military people to the executive have not been officially ordered by the Supreme Command of the Navy of the Air Force. So last year, this ambiguity played well into the hands of Bolsonaro and the military. They could use this ambiguity to dodge any serious question about the politicization of the military and the militarization of politics.
Very unfortunately, I'm afraid we've just lost you again. I'm really sorry for that, but it seems that no one else is able to hear you. I think maybe what I would use the last minutes for is to ask Thomas whether he would like or not to make a comment on what Ottavio has shared with us in his talk. Okay. I was told by Pedro that we have a few minutes which we could extend to because of these technical issues. Thomas, would you like to give any comment also regarding maybe some questions?
Yeah, I would. So first of all, Octavio's article here with Igor is well worth reading. You know, you could see it. It came out in the Portuguese version of the Journal of Democracy, and I was happy that Octavio brought up. I'm sorry, all the technical problems. That this, for me, when I write about Brazil and the challenges of democratic control, it refers back to this idea of control. There has to be some institutions. And the fact that in Brazil, they never established a career for civilians in the Ministry of Defense, for me, is telling. I mean, there's a career for a bean, for example, for intelligence. There's a career for everything. And to get into that career, you have to have a concurso. And if there's no concurso, there's no career, there's no nothing. So the whole thing about civilian control of the military in Brazil was kind of a bad joke, in fact, in that there was a minister who made, a couple of speeches or whatever, and one or two people around him. Then the only other civilians were the people who were handing out coffee, and everyone in between was either active. I've been to the Ministry of Defense many, many times in Brasilia. Of course, it used to be, a different, same building that used to be only military. They just changed the name on it. But all the people in there who matter are basically active duty or retired military. So without a civilian career, there really is no chance of having any kind of civilian control. This is it's a facade, as far as just like the facade of that building was changed. So I agree with Octavio and Igor, and I know many military in Brazil, and they're really in a quandary. I mean, it's a real problem, and it's a little bit. Let me put in a plug as well for what David P. in Berlin recently published in War on the Rocks, an article that dealt with examples of something very positive from Ecuador, from Chile, and from Brazil for the military here in the United States that didn't stand up as they probably should have to President Trump. Although I assume that there are some background communications about how these things are working out. I'm not party to them, but I'm assuming them. So I encourage you all to read the article by Octavio and Igor from the Journal of Democracy. Okay.
This was a very interesting panel, despite the technical difficulties. What I've learned from it, or what it shows, is that the relationship between civil and military, and especially between the military and the political dimension and the political leadership, is not always as clear-cut as one would hope. It has ambiguities, which were well exposed by Octavio's presentation as well. There are different arenas and different ways of not only looking at progress, but also at having to look at backsliding and a certain reversion of a certain trend. And if I may end on a broader note, what we're seeing globally is, in a way, a democratic recession, as someone has said. And basically what we are seeing as that the idea 30 years ago that the democratic regimes were on the rise, and that this would also reflect itself in a more balanced way between the civilian and the military relations. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is a big change. And as Director Helena Cadeiras has pointed out in her introduction, populism and nationalism has made an effect and is in fact contributing to this democratic recession which we are seeing. The emergence of new great powers is also will also influence this relationship, and in that sense, I would like to thank everyone that has been a participant in these two panels. I do apologize in the name of the Institute for the technical difficulties which we've experienced for the first time, as far as I can tell. I do thank our two speakers for their patience, and I do thank both Thomas Bruno and Ottavio Neto for their presentations. I can only refer to the excellent articles and books that they've published. So any question, any doubts, any comment that was left unanswered, I do suggest that you read their extensive knowledge and research that they have published. And I thank you very much for keeping with us. Thank you very much to all, and goodbye.